The final word from the circuit judge fell like a hammer in the silent meeting hall. Ilara felt the collective breath of Providence Gulch release in a soft sigh of finality, of pity, of morbid satisfaction. It was done. Thomas was gone, and with him, her life. Silas Davies, her husband's older brother, stepped forward. His face, usually ruddy with prosperity, was a mask of solemn duty that fooled no one. He held two documents in his thick landowner's hands. The first was the deed to the farm she and Thomas had built from raw prairie, their sweat and dreams soaked into every inch of its black soil. Silas, citing a debt clause Thomas had foolishly co-signed for him years ago, had claimed it all. The house, the barn, the fields, the future. The judge had stamped it, the law had blessed it, and the town had witnessed it. She was now a trespasser on her own land. The second document he offered her was a cruel joke wrapped in legal paper. "The family is not without mercy," Silas declared, his voice ringing with false charity. "We grant you the deed to the old Sinks property. It was my father's folly, and now, I suppose, it is yours." A few men in the back snickered. The Sinks, a worthless tract of broken limestone pits and ravines 10 miles out in the Badlands, a place where the earth had collapsed on itself, leaving a scar so ugly and barren that not even scrub grass would take root. It was land good for nothing but breaking an axle or losing a cow. It was a deed to a grave. Silas then pressed a few coins into her palm, the metal cold and insulting. $20, the price of a widow's banishment. "For your journey," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "Go east, find work in a city. There is nothing for you here." The unspoken words hung in the air. "You are no longer our problem." He closed her fingers over the coins, a gesture of dismissal so complete it felt like a physical shove. The door to her old life had not just been closed, it had been locked and barred from the inside. She was left with almost nothing. The simple wool dress on her back, worn boots, a small leather pouch containing the $20 and the worthless deed, and Borrow, Thomas's aging hound, who pressed against her leg, his low growl a solitary note of protest in the quiet hall. He was the only piece of her husband, of her past, they could not legally seize. The townspeople began to shuffle out, their eyes avoiding hers. A few of the women offered platitudes. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," one said. "Perhaps it's for the best," whispered another. Mr. Gable, the mercantile owner, cleared his throat. "You'll need a ticket for the stage, missus. Best be quick about it." But Ilara did not move toward the stage office. A silence fell over her, a calm so deep it felt like ice forming in her veins. She had shed all her tears in the weeks since Thomas's fever took him. There were none left. All that remained was a cold, hard kernel of refusal. She would not run. She would not beg. She would not disappear to satisfy their comfort. She walked out of the meeting hall, Borrow at her heel, and crossed the dusty street not to the stage depot, but to Mr. Gable's own mercantile. The bell above the door chimed, announcing her arrival. The men lingering by the pot-bellied stove fell silent. She walked past the barrels of pickles and sacks of flour, her gaze fixed. She laid a few of the coins on the polished wood counter. "I need a good axe," she said, her voice steady and clear, "a shovel, and 10 pounds of salt." Mr. Gable stared, his mouth slightly agape. This was not the shopping list of a woman heading east. This was the list of someone planning to dig in. He looked from her to the coins, then back to her determined face. He slowly nodded, turned, and retrieved the items. As she lifted the heavy tools, Silas Davies appeared in the doorway, a smirk playing on his lips. "Stocking your new home, Ilara?" he mocked. "Be careful you don't dig too deep. The devil lives in holes like that." She met his gaze, hoisted the shovel to her shoulder, and walked past him out the door, turning her back on the town and heading west, toward the grave they had given her. The journey to the Sinks was a pilgrimage into purgatory. The 10 miles from Providence Gulch might as well have been 100. The fertile plains gave way to cracked, sun-baked earth, then to rolling hills of sharp rock and thorny scrub. The weight of the axe and shovel dug into her shoulder, a constant biting reminder of the task ahead. Boro trotted silently beside her, his head low, sensing the grimness of their exodus. The sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, relentless and personal. By late afternoon, she stood on a ridge overlooking her inheritance. The sight stole the air from her lungs. It was worse than the stories. The land fell away into a chaotic jumble of pits, fissures, and collapsed hollows, as if a giant had clawed handfuls of earth from the ground and discarded them. Twisted, skeletal junipers clung to the edges of the pits, their roots exposed and searching. There was no green, only the pale gray of limestone and the dusty brown of dead earth. It was a landscape of failure, of ruin. A wave of despair so profound it made her knees weak washed over her. The town was right. Silas was right. This was a place to die, not to live. The wind, funneled through the ravines, moaned a desolate song. For a single terrifying moment, she considered turning back, walking until her boots fell apart, and simply ceasing to be. The weight of the shovel suddenly felt impossible, the foolish purchase of a doomed woman. Tears she thought were long gone, pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and sharp. It was Boro who broke the spell. With a sharp bark, he darted away, chasing a flash of white, a jackrabbit. The rabbit scrambled down the side of the nearest, largest pit, and the dog, heedless, plunged after it. He disappeared from sight. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. "Boro!" she cried, her voice swallowed by the wind. She scrambled to the edge of the pit, her own despair forgotten in a surge of panic. The sinkhole was perhaps 30 feet deep, with steep, fractured walls. She could see no sign of him. Fear gave her strength. She found a less vertical section of the wall and began to climb down, her fingers and toes finding purchase in the cracked limestone. She slid the last 10 feet, landing in a heap on the pit's floor. And then she felt it. The air was different here. The howling wind was gone, replaced by a profound stillness. It was cooler, the oppressive heat of the sun blocked by the high stone walls. The air tasted damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and stone. She saw Boro a few yards away, sniffing at a dark crevice in the far wall of the pit, the rabbit forgotten. He whined softly, looking back at her. As she walked toward him, her boot sank slightly into the ground. She looked down. The floor of the pit was not bare rock. It was covered in a layer of soil so dark it was almost black, rich and loamy, washed down from the surrounding plains over countless centuries. And from the crevice Boro had found, a tiny, impossibly persistent trickle of water seeped out, staining the limestone a darker gray. It was slow, but it was constant. Still air, water, soil. Here, at the bottom of this forsaken hole, were the 3 things the surface world lacked. She pressed her hand against the stone wall. It was cool to the touch, a reservoir of deep earth temperature, insulated from the brutal swings of the prairie climate. This was not a grave. A grave was something you put a life into. This place was something you could pull a life out of. The despair did not vanish, but it receded, replaced by a grim, ferocious resolve. The town had given her a hole in the ground. She would make it a home. The first week was a blur of brutal, punishing labor. Her body, accustomed to farm chores but not to this raw, elemental work, screamed in protest. Her hands, soft from a year of keeping a home, were the first to betray her. Blisters rose, broke, and bled, leaving her palms raw and weeping. The handle of the axe became an instrument of torture, slick with her own blood. Every swing sent a jolt of fire up her arms, but she did not stop. Her first task was to shape the main pit into a dwelling. It was the largest and deepest of the sinkholes, a rough oval about 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. One side was a sheer cliff face where the water seeped. The other sides were steep but scalable. Using the shovel, she began to level the floor, a back-breaking process of digging and hauling. She used the excavated rock and soil to build up the lower, more broken sections of the wall, creating a more uniform, defensible perimeter. Muscles she didn't know she had awakened in agony. Every morning she rose with the sun, her body so stiff she could barely move. Every evening she collapsed into her bedroll, too exhausted to eat, sleep a dead, dreamless sleep, and begin again. Slowly, agonizingly, a shape began to emerge. A level floor. Walls that felt less like a natural pit and more like a foundation. She chose the sheer rock face as the back of her home. It was there, near the water seep, that she began to build her hearth. She found flatter stones, and using a mud made from the dark soil and water, began to stack them. Her first attempts were clumsy, the stones tumbling down. She learned through failure, discovering how to place a larger stone to anchor the smaller ones, how to fit them together like a puzzle. She found a narrow fissure in the rock above, a natural chimney that snaked its way to the surface. It was a gift from the earth itself. After 4 days of painstaking work, she had a crude but functional fireplace and chimney stack. The roof was the greatest challenge. The sinks offered little in the way of timber. She spent 2 days searching the surrounding badlands, felling the tough, stringy junipers with her axe. The trees were small and twisted, but they were strong. She would drag each one back to the pit, her shoulders screaming as the rough bark scraped her skin. Getting them across the top of the pit was a feat of raw strength and leverage. She would get one end into position, then use all her weight to pivot the other end across the gap, praying it wouldn't slip and fall. She laid a dozen of these crude beams across the top of the sinkhole, lashing them together with rope she'd salvaged from her pack. On top of this frame, she wove a dense mat of the thorny scrub brush, and on top of that, she carefully laid slabs of prairie sod she had painstakingly cut and carried from the plains a mile away. Her roof, when finished, was level with the surrounding ground. From a distance, her home was invisible, just another patch of unremarkable earth. While the shelter took shape, she planned her other systems. The water was life itself. She spent an entire day carefully widening the seep with her knife, chipping away at the soft limestone until the trickle became a steady, if slow, stream. She dug a deep basin in the floor of her shelter, then lined it with the stickiest clay she could find, pounding it smooth and dense with a rock until it was watertight. Slowly, drop by drop, her cistern began to fill with clean, cool water. It was the sweetest sight she had ever seen. The other pits would be her gardens. While she worked on her shelter, she spent the evenings clearing the smaller sinkholes of loose rock, preparing the soil. She discovered that the deeper caves connected to her shelter were home to a colony of bats. Their guano, collected over centuries, was a treasure of rich nutrients. She painstakingly gathered it, mixing it into the black soil of the pits. She was not just a builder, she was a farmer, cultivating the earth in the belly of the earth. She built crude ladders to get in and out of the garden pits, and fences of thorny branches around their edges to keep out animals. After a month of relentless work, She was no longer the woman who had left Providence Gulch. Her hands were calloused and hard, her skin burned brown by the sun, her body lean and corded with muscle. She was tired, but it was the deep, satisfying exhaustion of creation. One evening, she stood back and looked at her work. A dwelling, sunken and secure. A hearth ready for fire. A cistern half full of water. And 3 garden pits, their soil turned and ready for seed. It was time to go back to town. The walk back to Providence Gulch was different. The weight of the tools was gone, but a new weight, one of purpose, settled on her. When she entered the town, people stopped and stared. Her dress was torn and stained with dirt and clay. Her hair was wild, and a long scratch ran across her cheek. She looked like a creature of the wilderness, not a townswoman. Whispers followed her as she walked to the mercantile. She placed her remaining coins on the counter. It was less than $10. "Mr. Gable," she said, her voice raspy from disuse, "I need 3 laying hens, a sack of seed potatoes, and if you have one, a nanny goat." Gable looked at her as if she were mad. "A goat? Chickens? Child, where in God's name are you keeping livestock out at the sinks?" "I have a place for them," she said simply. Her quiet certainty was unnerving. He shook his head but took her money. While he gathered the hens into a crate, Silas Davies strode in. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes taking in her ragged appearance. A cruel smile touched his lips. "Still playing in the dirt, Ilara?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "I heard you were digging. Thought you'd have hit hell by now." "I'm stocking my larder," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Larder?" he scoffed, laughing aloud. "You're stocking your own grave, woman." The men in the store chuckled along with him. The laughter followed her as she left, leading her small, bewildered goat and carrying the crate of clucking chickens. The journey back was slow, but her heart was light. Let them laugh. Winter was coming. Boro was her shadow, her sentinel, her only comfort. He had watched her every move during the long weeks of building, a silent, supportive presence. At night, he slept curled against her back, his warmth a living shield against the cold that seeped from the stone. His low growls alerted her to the presence of coyotes or the passing of a curious deer. When she had wept from sheer exhaustion, her hands bleeding and her spirit failing, he had licked the tears from her face, nudging his head against her until she found the strength to rise and pick up her tools again. He was the last living link to Thomas, a vessel of shared memory and unconditional loyalty. His companionship was the mortar that held her broken spirit together. As autumn painted the prairie grasses in shades of gold and rust, the mockery from Providence Gulch solidified into a local legend. Children, daring each other, would sometimes ride out to the edge of the sinks and peer down, hoping to catch a glimpse of the strange widow in her hole. They began to call her the Pit Witch. The name caught on among the adults, who found it a convenient way to dismiss the unsettling reality of her survival. It was easier to believe she was crazed than to accept that she might succeed where everyone else predicted failure. The men would talk at the mercantile. "Heard from a trapper," one would say, "that she talks to the rocks, sings to 'em." Another would add, "My boy says he saw smoke coming right out of the ground out there. No chimney, no cabin, just smoke." Silas Davies nurtured these stories, watering them with scorn. "It's a madness born of grief," he would proclaim, leaning against the counter. "The woman is digging her own tomb and calling it a home. She'll be gone by the first snow. The wolves will find her, or the cold will take her." Her place was given a name too, the Widow's Hole, or more simply, Ilara's Folly. The names were weapons, meant to isolate and diminish her, to turn her struggle into a cautionary tale. But Ilara heard none of it. Her world had shrunk to the rhythms of her own making. As the days grew shorter and a chill sharpened the air, she settled into a deep winter routine. Her mornings began before dawn, in the dark, warm heart of her shelter. The first task was always the fire. She would stir the embers from the night before, add new wood from the pile she had painstakingly gathered, and gently blow them back to life. The first flicker of flame was a daily victory against the encroaching cold. With the fire lit, she would tend her small livestock. The goat and the 3 hens lived in an adjoining alcove she had carved out of a softer section of rock, their pen clean and dry. Their body heat added to the warmth of the shelter, their soft noises a comfort in the silence. She would milk the goat, her hands sure and gentle, and collect the precious eggs the hens provided. This small, daily bounty felt like a miracle. Her life was a cycle of maintenance and care. She checked the water level in her cistern. She tended to her gardens in the pits, which, protected from the frost, were still producing hardy kale and turnips. She spent hours preserving food, salting strips of rabbit meat caught in snares, and storing root vegetables in a small, cold cellar she dug into the back wall. Her days were governed not by a clock, but by the needs of the fire, the animals, the plants, and her own body. It was a solitary existence, but it was not empty. It was ordered, purposeful, and deeply real. She was the sovereign of this small, subterranean kingdom, and her rule was absolute. The world outside, with its mockery and its judgment, faded into irrelevance. Before the great crisis came, smaller tests arrived to prove her systems. The first came with the autumn rains. A storm of unusual violence swept across the plains, turning the dry ravines into raging torrents. Water poured into her lowest garden pit, threatening to drown the nearly mature potato plants. For a full night, she worked by lantern light in the driving rain, soaked and freezing, digging a frantic drainage channel with her shovel to divert the flood. The water receded just as dawn broke, leaving her plants safe in the muddy but intact soil. Her design had held. She learned, adapted, and deepened the channel for the future. Later, as the first snows fell, a pack of coyotes, emboldened by hunger, grew daring. They circled her home at night, their yips and howls echoing off the stone walls. One night, they made a direct assault on the chicken coop. But Boro, ever vigilant, met them with a fury that belied his age. His ferocious barking and snarling defense from the entrance of the shelter drove them back. The thorny fences she had built around the pits proved their worth, tearing at the predators and preventing them from getting a foothold. Her defenses, both living and built, had worked. These small victories were deposits of confidence, hardening her resolve and affirming the strange wisdom of her choices. She was not just surviving, she was prevailing. The spring that followed her first winter was a liar. It came early, with a deceptive warmth that coaxed buds from the trees and green shoots from the prairie soil. The farmers and ranchers of Providence Gulch saw it as a blessing, a sign of a bountiful year to come. They planted their fields of wheat and corn with optimism, their hopes rising with the young crops. But the warmth was a fever. The rains did not come. The sun beat down with the intensity of midsummer, baking the fields and cracking the earth. The young crops withered. Then, in late May, the true disaster arrived. It began as a low hum on the western horizon, a sound that was felt in the bones as much as heard with the ears. It grew into a dull roar, the sound of a distant, monstrous waterfall. Then the sky darkened. It was not a storm cloud. It was a cloud of living things, a biblical plague of locusts, billions upon billions of them, moving as a single, ravenous entity. They descended upon Providence Gulch like a brown, devouring blanket. The sound was deafening, a chittering, clicking roar that drowned out all else. They covered everything. Fields of wheat that stood waist-high in the morning were chewed down to bare stalks by noon. The town's vegetable gardens, the pride of the local wives, vanished in minutes. Leaves were stripped from trees, leaving them skeletal and bare. The locusts ate until there was nothing left to eat, and then, as suddenly as they had arrived, they rose into the sky and were gone, leaving behind a scarred, silent, and utterly devastated landscape. The confidence of Providence Gulch shattered. The optimism of the early spring curdled into a thick, choking despair. The locusts had taken the year's harvest, and the drought that followed ensured nothing new would grow. The prairie grasses, chewed to the nub, did not recover. Silas Davies, the town's most prosperous rancher, walked through his ruined fields, the bare dirt crunching under his boots. His vast herds of cattle, their grazing lands turned to desert, began to weaken and die. The town's collective wealth, built on the promise of the soil, evaporated in a single afternoon. Their conventional homes, their sturdy barns, their sensible plans, all of it was proven worthless against the raw power of nature. They had built on the surface, and the surface had been scoured clean. Miles away, in her sunken home, Ilara heard the roar of the swarm. She saw the sky turn a sickening, roiling brown. She sealed the heavy wooden door to her shelter, a door she had fashioned from the planks of an old wagon abandoned in a ravine, and waited. The sound of the locusts crawling over her sod roof was like a hard rain, a constant scratching, clicking tide. But they could not get in. They swarmed over the edges of her garden pits, a writhing carpet of hunger, but they could not reach the precious green life tucked safely below. The steep limestone walls offered no purchase. Her world, insulated by a dozen feet of earth and stone, remained untouched. When the roar faded and she finally opened her door, the world above was a monochrome wasteland. But when she climbed down the ladder into her main garden pit, the air was still cool and damp, and the green leaves of her potato plants were whole, pristine, and shimmering with life. Her water still trickled from the rock. Her animals were safe. The town was wrong. The weeks that followed the swarm were a slow descent into famine. The town's stored grain dwindled. The price of flour at the mercantile quadrupled. Then it ran out entirely. The herds of cattle were slaughtered for meat, but without grazing, it was a finite resource. A quiet, desperate hunger settled over Providence Gulch. Families rationed their food, then their rations ran out. The bravado of the ranchers and farmers was replaced by the hollow-eyed look of men who could no longer feed their children. The town began to starve. One evening, as Ilara was banking the fire for the night, a sound came from above. It was not the wind, nor an animal. It was a frantic scratching at her door. Burro rose instantly, a low, menacing growl rumbling in his chest. Ilara placed a hand on his back to quiet him and listened. A voice, hoarse and broken, called her name. "Ilara, please." She did not recognize it at first. It was thin, stripped of all its familiar arrogance. She lifted the heavy bar from the door and opened it a crack. Silas Davies stood there, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. He was a ghost of the man who had cast her out. His fine clothes hung loosely on his shrunken frame. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild with a desperation that had burned away all his pride. He leaned against the stone doorframe as if he lacked the strength to stand on his own. "Silas," she said. It was not a question. He didn't ask for himself. He didn't have the pride for that. Or perhaps he knew he deserved to starve. He looked at her, and his face crumpled. "My daughter," he choked out, the words tearing from his throat. "Mary. She's sick. A fever from the hunger. She won't eat what little we have. The doctor says... He says she's fading." He looked down at his own hands, empty and useless. "I have nothing to trade you, nothing to offer. But my girl, Ilara, I'm begging you, is there anything at all?" Ilara looked at the man who had mocked her, who had laughed at her labor, who had confidently predicted her demise. The memory of his words, "stalking your own grave," was as clear as if he had spoken them yesterday. A cold, bitter satisfaction could have risen in her then. It would have been just. But as she looked at his broken face, she did not see an enemy. She saw a father terrified of losing his child. She saw past him to the town full of other fathers, other mothers, watching their own children weaken. Her struggle had never been about vengeance. It had been about life. She gave him no answer in words. She simply turned from the door and walked to the small, cool cellar she had dug into the back wall of her shelter. She lifted the wooden lid. The earthy smell of potatoes and carrots and turnips filled the air. She filled a burlap sack. She went to the small nesting boxes and gathered the day's eggs, still warm. She returned to the doorway and pushed the sack and the basket of eggs into his trembling hands. Then she looked him in the eye. "This won't be enough," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The child needs broth, and she needs to be warm. Bring her here. The air is cleaner in the earth." Silas returned an hour later, carrying his daughter wrapped in a thin blanket. Mary was limp in his arms, her face pale and her breathing shallow. When he stepped over the threshold into Ilara's home, he stopped dead, his mouth falling open. The warmth hit him first, a gentle, steady heat from the stone hearth that was utterly alien in the cold, drought-stricken world outside. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom of a town without lamp oil, slowly adjusted. He saw the impossible. The space was not a damp, miserable cave. It was a room, ordered and clean. Shelves carved into the rock held neat rows of clay jars. A side of salted meat hung from a ceiling beam. The small goat and chickens rustled contentedly in their clean strawed pen. From the cistern in the corner came the soft, constant sound of trickling water. It was a sanctuary of abundance in a world of lack. His gaze was drawn to an arched opening in the far wall. Through it, by the light of Ilara's lantern, he saw something that shattered his understanding of the world. A garden. A thriving, vibrant patch of green, with the broad leaves of potato plants and the feathery tops of carrots growing deep inside a stone pit, sheltered and alive. He looked from the miraculous garden back to Ilara, who was quietly stirring a pot over the fire. He could not reconcile the woman before him, this calm, capable provider, with the crazed pit witch of his own malicious stories. The sheer, rugged competence of what she had built, the profound and simple wisdom of it, struck him like a physical blow. All his wealth, all his land, all his status, it had all been blown away like dust. She had built her life on rock, and he had built his on sand. Shame, profound and absolute, washed over him. He sank to his knees, his daughter still cradled in his arms. "We called this a grave," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of his folly. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "My God, Ilara, we were the fools. We were the ones living in tombs all along." Ilara did not answer his confession with triumph. She did not say, "I told you so." Her victory was not in his humiliation, but in her ability to offer grace. She ladled some steaming broth into a wooden bowl and brought it to him. "Give her this," she said gently. "It is warm." Then she took a baked potato from the hearth, its skin crisp and salty, and pushed it into his hand. "And you must eat," she said, her voice devoid of judgment. "You are weak." Her quiet, practical kindness was more devastating to his pride than any rebuke could have been. It was the final, undeniable proof of her strength and of his failure. The news of what Silas Davies had found in the sinks spread through the starving town like a fever. At first it was disbelief, then a desperate, clinging hope. People began to make the long walk out from Providence Gulch, not as mockers, but as pilgrims. They came in ones and twos, then in families, their faces etched with hunger and shame. They would stand at the edge of the pit, staring down at the impossible green of her gardens, and they would ask for help. Ilara met them all with the same quiet grace she had shown Silas. She had no grand speeches. She simply shared what she had. She organized a rationing system, giving each family enough to sustain them, but no more. She taught them. She took them to the plains and showed them which hardy roots could be dug up and boiled. She showed them how to set snares, how to find water in hidden places. She became their teacher, their provider, their unlikely leader. The name Pit Witch died on their lips, replaced with a hushed, reverent title, the Garden Mother. Her authority was absolute, born not of wealth or title, but of undeniable results. The town council, the same men who had watched her banishment in silence, now came to her for instructions. She directed the work, and they obeyed without question. They organized teams to dig for roots, to hunt, to ration the water from the town's nearly dry well. Her sunken home became the capital of this new, desperate society. One day, Silas Davies came to her, holding the deed to his own farm, the farm he had taken from her. He offered it to her, his eyes downcast. "This is yours," he said. "It always was. I was a thief, blinded by greed. Take it back." Ilara looked at the paper, the symbol of the life that had been stolen from her. She could have taken it. It would have been justice. But she shook her head. She looked around at the stone walls of her home, at the hearth that had kept her warm, at the cistern that had given her water. "My home is here," she said. "I built it. This land is mine." She had no need for his farm. She had everything she needed in the earth beneath her feet. The famine eventually broke, as all things do. Rains returned, and the prairie slowly began to heal. But the people of Providence Gulch were forever changed. They had been humbled by the earth, and they had been saved by a woman they had discarded. They did not forget the lesson. When they began to rebuild, they did not build as they had before. They remembered the wisdom of Ilara's sanctuary. They began to dig. Following her example, families created their own sunken gardens, protected from the wind and the sun. They built stone-lined cisterns to capture every drop of rain. New homes were built partially underground, using the thermal mass of the earth to stay cool in the summer and warm in the winter. The very architecture of the town began to transform, adapting to the harsh realities of the land rather than trying to dominate it. Ilara's methods, once seen as the folly of a madwoman, became the foundation of the community's survival and its new prosperity. Her home, the Widow's Hole, became known as the Life Spring, a landmark and a legend. Travelers passing through would carry the story with them, the tale of the woman who grew a garden in a grave and fed a town from the bounty of a worthless hole. Years passed. Ilara remained in her sunken home, a respected elder, a quiet oracle. The town thrived, its people hardened and humbled and wise. She never married again, her life intertwined with the earth she had cultivated. The final scene of her story is one of peace. An old woman, her face a map of wrinkles carved by sun and time, sits at the edge of her main pit garden, now lush and overflowing. The descendants of her first chickens peck at the ground near her feet, and a great-grandson of Boro rests his graying head on her lap. Below, the lights of Providence Gulch twinkle in the twilight, a town reborn from her resilience. She built more than a shelter, she built a future. Her legacy was not written in laws or etched on monuments, but in the quiet, enduring strength of a spirit that refused to be buried, and the profound grace that chose to feed the very hands that had cast her out.